Welcome to Speculative Sandbox. This is Vicky Lawn, and I'm going on a short hiatus to work on book revisions, but I've asked my fellow author friends to take care of the podcast while I'm away. Don't forget to subscribe or follow Speculative Sandbox on Instagram and X, formerly Twitter, to get episode notifications and upcoming news. I look forward to chatting again soon.
What would you say if I told you that Moby Dick is one of the greatest secondary world fantasies ever written? Hello, welcome to Speculative Sandbox. My name is David Hopkins. I am not your usual host, but Vicky was kind enough to let me take over for this episode. I am an adult epic fantasy author. My novel, The Dryad's Crown, just came out this year. It is available as a paperback, ebook, and audiobook. And for today's episode of the Speculative Sandbox, I want to talk about Moby Dick. And yes, I realize that Moby Dick is not usually shelved in the fantasy and sci-fi section of your local bookstore. But I would argue that Moby Dick actually is a fantasy story. And not only is it a fantasy story, it is a wonderful masterclass in world building. Moby Dick was published in 1851 by Herman Melville. Moby Dick is an amazing whale of a novel. It is a chunky novel, which already put it in a similar category as some of its epic fantasy peers. Part of the thing that makes Moby Dick such a thick read is the fact that much of Moby Dick is spent on world building. Herman Melville has decided that before you get to hunt the whale, you have to learn all about the whaling industry, which brings us to Nantucket, where our novel begins. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on the shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hippos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to the sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, some time or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me. In this opening section of Moby Dick, our narrator, Ishmael, is pining for the sea almost as if it were a wonderland. I was thinking about the wonderful novella, Every Heart a Doorway, which tells the story of children who have returned from wonderland worlds and now have to live out their days in the real world. And in some ways, this is a very similar tale. Ishmael has seen things on the ocean, and the ocean itself is a secondary world that he pines, he longs to go after. Now, obviously, the ocean is not a fantasy world. It exists on this world. But put yourself in the minds of a reader back in 1851. How many of them had ever sailed on the ocean? How many of them had seen anything remotely close to what is being described in the novel? Probably not many. And so Moby Dick is part adventure story, but it's also a travel story. It is allowing the readers to visit a world that they are unfamiliar with. In fact, Herman Melville's two most popular novels, Typee and Omoo, are both very much grounded in that sort of travel odyssey narrative. And so we get that with the ocean. The ocean is strange, it is mysterious, It is the secondary world that Herman Melville describes with such passion and vigor. In fact, the premise of Moby Dick is equal parts epic and absurd. Ahab wants to hunt a single whale in all of the ocean. Now, it is a very recognizable whale, and there's a little bit of fate that comes into play here when they finally do find Moby Dick. But the premise of finding a single whale in all of the oceans, in all of the world, is absurd. And yet, it is the kind of epic journey that is so familiar to us in the epic fantasy novels. So, the question that we have to ask of Moby Dick is really the question that every epic fantasy author has to ask of their own work, which is, couldn't you have written something shorter? Why did this book need to be so large? Couldn't you have abridged it a little bit? And the whole subject of abridgment, particularly when it pertains to Moby Dick, is an interesting one because a lot of these chapters, the one that goes through the various parts of the whale and its commercial uses and the different breeds of whale and how the whales are stored on the ship, these chapters could be lifted and thrown in the trash pretty easily and make a shorter and more digestible novel. So why didn't Herman Melville do that? And why are abridged versions of Moby Dick actually kind of hard to find, even though they would be relatively easy to create? And it reminds me, there's an article in The New Yorker back in 2007 called The Corrections by Adam Gopnik. And he said, when considering the abridging of Moby Dick, this is what he said: the subtraction does not turn good work into hack work. It turns a hysterical, half-mad masterpiece into a sound, sane book. So, abridging it turns a hysterical, half-mad masterpiece into a sound, sane book. Then Joel Cuthbertson in LitHub wrote a response to that article saying, a sound, sane book is a terrible waste of Melville's prose and vision. And I would say the same thing of most epic fantasy authors, the ones who really have impressed us, that, yeah, a sound, sane book is a terrible waste of prose and vision. Think about, and we have to talk about Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. If you view it as one book, which it was certainly written with that intent, yeah, the book is filled with poetry that really doesn't do much to further the plot. There is a whole almost third of the first section of the book where they're in the Shire, and a lot of that stuff feels a little bit meandering. All the stuff with Tom Bombadil, it feels like can be taken out. And in fact, in the movie, it is taken out. But for anyone who loves Tolkien, they will tell you that each one of those pieces is indispensable, and they will give you meaningful and compelling reasons why. So, for instance, one of the reasons why we spend so much time in the Shire is because we have to establish the stakes. What is at risk here if Frodo and Sam fail in their mission? Well, we lose the Shire. Well, why should I care about the Shire? Well, I care about the Shire because I spent so much time there as a reader. And in many ways, the same thing can be said of Moby Dick. All the things that we have in there, we lose something more meaningful, which is the context of why these things matter later on in the story. You know, I would say that that whole idea of the hypnotic immersion that happens in these longer books when you've invested hundreds and hundreds of pages kind of building and setting up this world, it has a sort of lulling power to it. In many ways, the first 2/3 of Moby Dick serves the last third. If you've never read Moby Dick before, I will tell you now that I think the last third of Moby Dick is some of the most thrilling reading I have ever done. Now, does that mean that you will have the same response if you skip the first 2/3 and go straight to the last third? I don't think so. I think that you have to get through the first 2/3 in order to enjoy fully the payoff of that final third where we actually really get into the chase of the Pequod going after Moby Dick. Eddie Campbell and Alan Moore wrote a graphic novel called From Hell, and there's a large section of the book at the beginning that is a Masonic tour of England and the significance of the architecture and the Masonic influences on some of the architecture. It seems to be just a self-indulgent exploration by Alan Moore, but when you get to the end of From Hell, and I don't want to spoil anything, there is a moment where all that stuff just comes together in a beautiful, beautiful way. I actually think that Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is another example of this, where the first part of the book is in service to the last part of the book. Way of Kings is an amazing novel, but it can be a bit of a slog. However, all of it pays off so amazingly well towards the end until you get to a part where you can't put it down because the book is just so engaging at the last third of the book. And so I think that Moby Dick has become the inspiration for the Tolkiens and the Sandersons and the Alan Moores of the world, who we might uncharitably say that they are being indulgent, but really what they're doing is setting up this world. They're casting us onto the sea so that when we get to the chase, there is a deeper profundity to it. There's this idea of world building as a way to slow down the pace of the reading, world building as pace setting. Think about if you're eating at a fine restaurant. You want to eat the meal slowly so that you can savor it and enjoy it. You don't want to wolf down the food, because if you do, you might as well just be eating a hamburger. It's not enough to be served good food. You also have to eat it in a way that you can enjoy it. And I do think that some of the beauty of world building is the beauty of pacing. If you will allow me to be indulgent myself, I'm going to read a section from my own book, The Dryad's Crown. And this was my tribute to Herman Melville. The provisions within the amoet included several boxes of salted beef and pork, pickled herring, and dried cod, wax-coated cheese wheels stored in a case, a crane with bottles of wine and brandy packed in sawdust, jugs of oil and vinegar, barrels of fresh water, a crate of hardtack biscuits, sack of white peas, oats, barley, rye, flour, mustard seed, and beans, sacks of onions, garlic, and potatoes, a large bag of salt, ceramic pots of butter stored in a crate, and a tub of whale blubber, which had numerous uses, chiefly as fuel for the lanterns. There were several rope coils of varied thicknesses, tools for repairs the ship may need, including hammers and a lidded bucket of nails, additional planks, as well as a barrel of tar, two hay bales, stacked bags of sand, a folded replacement sail, extra lanterns and candles, netting and hooks, a row of lock boxes with the personal effects of the crew, scrub brushes, squares of cut cloth, brooms and mops, and a series of pulleys hanging from hooks on the starboard side. The trade goods were in the largest crates, packed with sawdust and nailed shut. The contents were a mystery, although from the smell, Gideon guessed that a few of these crates were packed with sweet leaf. Each crate was marked with a family seal to indicate third-party traders and another seal to mark the intended recipient, along with the agreed-upon cost. The first mate was paid extra to handle the coin and make certain every crate was exchanged for the correct amount. Okay, I promise you that my whole book is not like that. But it was in a section of the book where I was really trying to express the tedium of them being in the hull of the ship during the entirety of this sea voyage. And I felt like doing a Melville-esque accounting of all the supplies in the hull of the ship would not only be appropriate, but would also be an interesting way to slow down the reader a little bit. And that is another thing that world building does. It slows us down. Recently, I watched a video in which a group of notable fantasy authors were debating, what did you have to have in order for your book to be a fantasy? Did it need swords? Did it need dragons? Did it need magic or a magic system of some sort? And every time something was brought up as being indispensable, of course, one smug author would shoot it down, giving several examples of various novels that did not have those elements and yet still qualified as fantasy. And so ultimately, the idea of fantasy was kind of a I know it when I see it type mentality, that there's something transcendent, there is something numinous about the epic fantasy. And that's why I think that Moby Dick falls in that category. There may not be magic, but it's not fantasy in the most traditional sense. So I'm really asking you to expand your definition of what fantasy is. But I also think that Melville expands our understanding of why world building is so crucial to novels like this. I do want to end with one more excerpt from Moby Dick, and this is towards the end of the novel, in the chase. Suddenly, the waters around them slowly swelled in broad circles, then quickly upheaved, as if sideways sliding from a submerged berg of ice. Swiftly rising to the surface, a low rumbling sound was heard, a subterraneous hum, and then all held their breaths, as bedraggled with trailing ropes and harpoons and lances, a vast form shot lengthwise, but obliquely from the sea, shrouded in a thin, drooping veil of mist. It hovered for a moment in the rainbowed air and then fell swamping back into the deep. Crushed 30 feet upwards, the waters flashed for an instant like heaps of fountains, then brokenly sank in a shower of flakes, leaving the circling surface creamed like new milk round the marble trunk of the whale. "Give way!" cried Ahab to the oarsmen, and the boats darted forward to the attack. But maddened by yesterday's fresh irons that corroded in him, Moby Dick seemed combinedly possessed by all the angels that fell from heaven, the wide tiers of welded tendons overspreading his broad white forehead beneath the transparent skin, looked knitted together as head on. He came churning his tail among the boats and once more flailed them apart, spilling out the irons and lances from the two mates' boats and dashing in one side of the upper part of their bows, but leaving Ahab's almost without a scar. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for listening to me. And thank you to Vicky for allowing me to take over on this episode of Speculative Sandbox. My name is David Hopkins. You can find me at thatdavidhopkins.com. And yeah, I hope that while you are making your TBR list for the new year, that you might consider Moby Dick for one of your fantasy reads.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.